We should start.
Yeah, we should start.
So listen, I'm absolutely delighted, Jette, that you accepted my invitation, despite the fact that you were actually supposed to be on holidays with your family, to come and talk to us about borders and bridges, social movements, and linguistic identity in Hong Kong. And we're very much looking forward to hearing you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, even though I'm actually in South Australia. And I'll just take you through the beginning of my talk. I'm just going to move through a bit more quickly because I do want to go and look at the data and spend a bit more time on that. But this is a talk about the impact of social movements on linguistic identity in Hong Kong. And in particular, when I talk about linguistic identity, I'm talking about Hong Kong's 3 official spoken languages, English, Cantonese, and Putonghua, as well as Hong Kong English, which is a post-colonial variety of English in Hong Kong. And I'm looking at acceptance and identity marking of these languages and varieties against a changing political landscape. And I'll show you the time frame of the study. And in particular, in light of political engagement among Hong Kong's youth, because the majority of the participants in this study are secondary or tertiary students. So really at the heart of the talk is just examination of the complex interplay between identities, language, and varieties that has unfolded in Hong Kong as the political landscape has shifted. And I just want to pause here and note that this really is also about how post-colonial varieties of English are gaining legitimacy in the different contexts around the world. And I'm really focusing the variety against the language ecology. And I think that's really important to look not just at the variety of English that's under study, so Hong Kong English, but to look at the other languages of that context. So English, Putonghua, and Cantonese, but also the socio-political context, because of course, the way languages gain acceptance in different contexts is really different. And Hong Kong is a very much of a interesting site of study. So I do have a number of theoretical frameworks that I'll be referring to. I'll just highlight a few points. Bordeaux, I'm looking at particular how languages are viewed as economic capital in Hong Kong. Brewer's optimal distinctiveness theory, I'm looking particularly at how language is used to denote a shared in-group distinctiveness from the out-group. Gallen-Willard's linguistic authority, I'm looking particularly at the notion of authenticity and how languages are viewed as being as authentic languages of a particular community or speakers. And I'm also obviously referring to Schneider's dynamic model of post-colonial Englishes. The study is a longitudinal one. It's been ongoing since 2014. I'll talk about the political background to this time, but just to highlight the type of data, it is primarily a survey, open-ended and closed-ended survey data, as well as interviews. And then also I've looked at YouTube videos, social media, all kinds of photo and text as well analysis. And this has been ongoing for since 2014. I have 6 data sets to date. And just to look at the political backdrop, this is very important to the data finding. The survey, the first part of the study was launched really on the eve of the umbrella movement. In fact, at the time that I launched the study, when the umbrella movement unfolded, just literally days later, I thought for sure the study was doomed. Nobody was ever going to participate because everybody was busy. And there's so much going on in Hong Kong. But in fact, what happened was it really drew a huge interest. And so the beginning of the study between 2014 and 15 is really a time of immense political social movements in Hong Kong. So that's a very particular time frame that we're going to look at, and very important time frame. The other very important time frame is the time between 2017, 19, and 20. Now, these 2014 umbrella movement protests were in response to a decision by Beijing that Hong Kong was not going to be allowed to hold democratic elections for the next chief executive, which was in 2017. And in 2017, the election did go ahead, but it was not the democratic election that Hong Kong had been promised in the basic law. And so that was already also a very tense time in Hong Kong. In 2019, then, the then chief executive wanted to have a law, an extradition treaty with mainland China passed in the legislative council, and that led to a huge, I'm sure you're all very well aware, 6-month protests in the streets of Hong Kong, which then led to, in 2020, the introduction of the national security law. So these two sets of time periods, 2014 to 15, 2017, 19, and 20, very tense politically in Hong Kong. And of course, that is still the case today. So just to very quickly review the languages of Hong Kong that I introduced at the beginning, Cantonese is the main language of Hong Kong. It is the most widely spoken variety of Chinese. It has an important role in government, in education in Hong Kong. It's spoken about 88% of Hong Kong's population. English has a very long history as a language of government. Of course, it was the colonial language introduced in 1842, and it still has retained this important status as in education, and of course, as part of Hong Kong's status as a global financial center. Putonghua became a national language in Hong Kong in 1997 after the handover. It was perceived to perhaps replace English as the economic capital, but it has not really done so. There is a lot of tension between Putonghua and Cantonese, the perception that Cantonese is being slowly replaced by Putonghua, in particular in the schools. So English as a medium of instruction, or Chinese as a medium of instruction policies. Different schools have different policies, but with the Chinese medium of instruction, the Chinese has, of course, traditionally been Cantonese. That is now slowly being replaced by Putonghua. So in Hong Kong, there's a real strong sense that Cantonese is slowly losing its status in the city and is only being replaced by Putonghua, and that's leading to linguistic tensions as well. So what I'm looking at in the research I've been doing, of course, gender is a common variable in sociolinguistic and attitude studies, but I'm also looking at cultural identification, and in particular, the 3 types of identifications which are very ubiquitous in Hong Kong. One is of a Hong Konger. This could actually be any inhabitant of Hong Kong, but it really has become a local identity, geographically restricted to people who are really, in some ways, not necessarily political, but very much engaged in a localist identity, a grassroots identity of seeing Hong Kong as a unique geographic and cultural and linguistic space. The Hong Kong Chinese identity really is more of a bicultural identity, somebody who really views themselves as from Hong Kong, but part of the larger China. Whereas Chinese is an ethnic identity, but also within Hong Kong is very much viewed as a national PRC identity. So just to give you an idea, this is just the initial survey across the years of the study from 2020 to 2014 to 2020. Just to look here, under cultural identification, you'll see there's been a really significant increase in the number of people who really identify as a Hong Konger. 61% was already the majority of the participants of the research in 2014. By 2020, I had 87% of the respondent index this Hong Konger identity, and the Hong Kong Chinese, that real bridging or global, more bicultural identity, we're really seeing a greater decrease across time. And all the research that is done in Hong Kong on identity have very similar findings, that the Hong Konger identity is really strengthening in Hong Kong. The other thing I want to point out is the political engagement. I didn't actually ask this in the earlier parts of the study, but from 2017 on, I did. And as you can see here, the level of political engagement has also increased significantly from 2017 to 2019, from 28% of the respondents to 50% in 2019. Now, what do I mean by political engagement? I do tell the participants my definition, which is an interest or active involvement in local Hong Kong politics. And I do also ask them what their political sort of leanings are. And as you can see, that's also shifted significantly over time. So in 2017, 58% said they lean towards pro-democracy, localist parties, and that has increased to 92% in 2019, 83% in 2020. And here you can just see the shift from 2017 in 28% indicating they're interested or engaged in politics to 50% in 2019. So this is a big increase across time. So this is just another way of looking at the data and to try to link to see how all these variables cluster together. And you can see that across time of the three identifications, the identification that's more likely to be politically engaged are people who indexed as Hong Konger identity. And you can see how much that also has increased across time. So by 2020, 60% of the respondents who indexed as Hong Konger identity say that they're politically engaged or interested. Gender is a very small variable here. It's not as significant. So the first thing I ask, or we'll talk about today, is the language of self-identity. I asked the participants to tell me how they would index their own identity, whether they would index, they could choose any languages. It was very open. And the main results were this. So I found that the three main linguistic identities were Cantonese monolingual or bilingual Cantonese English or Cantonese English Putonghua trilingual. So this is up to self, how they view themselves linguistically. As you can see across time, this has increased significantly towards this bilingual identity, which is quite interesting because English has always been viewed as a pragmatic or economic language in Hong Kong. It's never really been linked with the language of identity. That has really been Cantonese. So for it to increase so significantly between the 2017 and 19 data sets, and then to stay relatively stable in 2020 is quite interesting. There are a number of people who indexed this trilingual identity, of course. You can see across time, it's be around 16 to 18%. That may increase across time as well as more people, particularly the younger generation, have more Putonghua in the school systems. Now, I did try to link that also with some of the variables to make this easy for you. I'll just circle the three that have to do with the bilingual identity. And we can see color-coded here. The colors, the green shows it's, and the orange show this is a significant difference, the green being the higher number. So if you just look across, you can see that at all three time periods, people who are likely to index this bilingual identity are also more likely to be politically engaged. More men than women are likely to have this bilingual identity, and they're also more likely to have a Hong Konger identity. If we just look at the trilingual identity, this is this kind of tricultural. Not surprisingly, we do see this link with the Hong Kong Chinese, which is that bilingual identity. So just to sum that up for you, what we're really seeing here is that English is really becoming, like Cantonese, an authentic local language. It's really becoming viewed as a language of the self, particularly for men, those who have more of a localist Hong Kong identity or are more likely to be involved in politics. So the second part of that is I look at what they view then as the language of Hong Kong, because they may not necessarily see that their own identity linguistically is the same as what they view the Hong Kong identity is linguistically. So as you can see here, even more interesting across time, there's very little change, and it's quite uniform that the majority of participants do see Hong Kong as having that bilingual identity. There are very few people see Hong Kong as being trilingual. In fact, fewer people see Hong Kong as being trilingual than they see themselves as trilingual. So that's a very interesting difference as well. When we look at it by these different variables, we also see that actually there's not a lot of difference. None of the variables, maybe here and there, there's some significant differences by the variables, but really overall, it's quite uniform. So this perception that Hong Kong is bilingual is really consistent across time. And it's also very consistent across, regardless of the gender of the participant, their cultural identification, and their political engagement. Whereas the representation of the self is very much related to gender, cultural identification, and political engagement. So what we're really seeing here is that there's a much more of a uniform view of Hong Kong. And the quote from the participants, for example, say the bilingual ability is what distinguishes Hong Konger from other Chinese. I'm not a Chinese, but I'm a Hong Konger and a global citizen. This is why they think that Hong Kong has a bilingual identity. So this brings us to the Hong Kong English identity, and Hong Kong English as the identity of the Hong Konger in English. Hong Kong English is very often researched in opposition to British and American English, very often viewed as being stigmatized, being inferior, not legitimate. But actually, I'm seeing that it's becoming quite widely accepted, in particular, I think, in relation to this backdrop of the political change across time. So what I have here is a composite of some of the data that I've been looking at. And that is the Hong Konger identity I've just showed you, and Cantonese English, self and Hong Kong identity, and the Hong Kong, the political engagement, which I've also just showed you. But I asked 3 questions. Do you speak Hong Kong English? Is Hong Kong English a real or legitimate variety? And do you want to speak Hong Kong English? Now, what we're seeing across time is really the significant changes, particularly 2014 to 15 and 2017 through 19 and 20. And very much the most interesting is statistic about wanting to speak Hong Kong English. Now, very few people in the beginning of the research wanted to speak Hong Kong English. This has risen really dramatically across time. So when we get to 2020, we have around 40%, a bit above 40%, saying, yes, I do want to speak Hong Kong English. It is an important part of my identity. We can actually look at the characteristics again, how that connects with these variables again, acceptance. There's some connection with gender and political engagement. But if we look at wanting to speak, it's very much connected again with these same variables. So people who are indexing the Hong Kong identity, who are more politically engaged, and also who have, in many ways, a male gender, are more likely to want to speak Hong Kong English and view that as an important part of their linguistic identity. So that brings us to sort of the summary of the findings here. So there's been a period of really rapid change in the acceptance of Hong Kong English. And you can't really, as I've said at the beginning of the study, you really have to look at the background of all the languages in the language ecology of Hong Kong. So regardless of what context you're studying, when we look at varieties of English, we really have to look at the wider language ecology. You also have to look at the socio-political context of these languages. So English, I think, has increased in value in Hong Kong as a marker of the self and the Hong Kong identity. And part of that is the introduction of Putong Wine to the language ecology of Hong Kong, and that this perception that the linguistic space of Hong Kong is becoming mainlandized. And so there's, I think, this perception that there's a need to sort of protect the linguistic space of Hong Kong. So if we look at Schneider's model and we think of the model in relation to Hong Kong, it doesn't actually fit very well, which Schneider himself acknowledges. Hong Kong didn't become an independent nation after the colonial period ended, nor is it a stable young nation. It is part of the PRC, and so it has become part of another country with a different history and culture and language and governance. And so this is a very different scenario, and I think obviously makes it a very interesting setting. And so basically what we're seeing is that how people represent themselves are really based on their own perceptions of their cultural identity and their political engagement. And the rise of Hong Kong English is related to this rise of the Hong Konger identity, which is driven by these political divisions and the need to create this, I think, this optimal distinctiveness to protect Hong Kong's political, geographic, and linguistic space. So I just want to share with you just a few quotes before I wrap up. Really what I think about the need to create this optimal distinctiveness. So what we're seeing people identify the bilingualism in Hong Kong is quotes like, because Hong Kong is an English and Cantonese city, a Hong Konger speaks Cantonese, a Hong Konger speaks English. And so to sort of summarize that, I feel that there's this increasing need to carve out this separate bilingual Cantonese identity to create this political or geographic or linguistic border for Hong Kongers to, again, protect the linguistic space. I have, I think, run out of time, so I'll just stop here, but I'm very happy to answer any questions about anything I've spoken about. I do have some other slides, so I can also show those as well.
you.
As Bob Dylan said, the times they are a-changing, huh?
Yes.
So please, questions, comments, thoughts.
I have a very basic question.
They're also good.
Good morning or good afternoon or evening, I don't know. I come from a university in Spain, and pardon my basic question again, but Putonghua, is it the language of what place?
Well, People's Republic, it's spoken widely across the world, of course, but it is the national language, Mandarin Chinese. It is the national language of the People's Republic of China, of which Hong Kong is now obviously a part of, a region of. So yes, so it's been introduced into Hong Kong, obviously several years before the handover, but now is an official language and is increasingly being used in education, but also in other spaces. There's some in some sectors of government, there might be a greater usage. So there is this tenseness, as I said, tension between people who feel that Cantonese is really the grassroots, it's the local language, and this new language that is coming into the space. And so there's this need to protect it. And I think, you know, Cantonese is being viewed as possibly being under threat because of that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I knew Mandarin Chinese, of course.
Yeah, it's just another, it's the way we speak about Putonghua in Hong Kong, yes.
And you know, it's a very legitimate question because increasingly that term is being used, but in the English-speaking world, it's still not quite there yet as a term. So I completely understand why you don't connect those two things.
This one comes with another one. Well, I mean, why do you think there is this tension between Cantonese and Putonghua and not with English, it being, again, another imposed language?
I think that's the interesting part, is that there's never really this threat. English has never been viewed in the same way as a threat or a risk towards Cantonese. One is that I think they're just viewed as, because you've got two Chinese languages, there's already an association there that they're, you know, they sort of occupy in some regards a similar sort of linguistic space, whereas English is this very much international language, and it has a connection with the previous colonial rule, for which there is quite a bit of nostalgia, I think, now in Hong Kong. And I think people view Hong Kong as this global financial center, and English is really a very important means of being part of that economically, financially. But like the change I think is seeing with English is that it's not just this financial or economic power that it can give people. Great proficiency in English is obviously gives you advantages. So that's the linguistic capital. But actually the fact that it's become much more than that, it's now being embraced as part of the local identity. And that I think is to carve out a uniqueness. So it's not just the Cantonese, because Cantonese is also spoken around the world. It's spoken across the border, of course, in Guangdong province. It's spoken many other places globally. But the fact that you've got this bilingual, you've got the heritage of Hong Kong, the British colonialism, that makes English very unique in addition to Cantonese. And I think that's why there really isn't that same tension. There isn't the belief that one will edge out the other, but in fact that they can coexist and they are unique to the Hong Kong identity. Whereas Putonghua is the national language that's being brought in to Hong Kong after the handover, actually right before the handover. And it's now beginning to occupy the space that Cantonese has been occupying. So the Chinese medium of instruction schools, the shift is, you know, slowly the Chinese has been Cantonese to Putonghua. We're seeing that increase. So if a school has a CMI, they may suddenly be shifting towards using Putonghua instead of Cantonese, whereas the English will stay the same. So it's never had that same fraught or tense relationship. It's always had its own sort of unique role, and I think increasingly being embraced as a unique characteristic symbolizing Hong Kong's history, but also the international uniqueness of Hong Kong as a global financial center. And that's what makes it quite significant identifier.
Brilliant. You're dying to say it. I know you are.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Professor Edwards. I'm Rita from Shanghai. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. Actually, I can echo some of the observation from a mainlander's perspective, and especially during the 2016-2019, we had those sort of, we emphasize the importance of Putonghua, of course, instead of English. And we have a lot of policies, written down ones, to get rid of English, or some sort of, we censored a little bit of the textbooks at that time. So I wonder, is it history, or is it the trend? As always, all those political things happen, and then we raise the awareness of the languages we speak. Like only in 2016, 2019, Hong Kongers suddenly realized, all right, we have this identity as a Cantonese speaker and English bilingual speaker. While, what if there's no political tensions? What if we are the peaceful world? And maybe they will suddenly realize, okay, we speak Chinese or something like that. I wonder, because now in mainland, for example, in Shanghai, we believe we are, of course, Chinese, and Shanghainese Chinese. We wouldn't say that we are Chinese, but we also have our languages. How can things happen to raise the awareness from an individual's perspective, or maybe from researchers' perspective? I wonder if you have any advice from this perspective.
Well, as unfortunately, what I can't do is tell you what the research shows before. The way English has always been positioned in Hong Kong with the research, it's always been looking at the integrative versus instrumental, pragmatic kind of usefulness of English. And so nobody's really tapped into this idea. Is it really an identity marker? How people have talked about it as symbolic capital and being very important in Hong Kong, but really the discussion hasn't been had. So it's hard to know whether before sort of 2017, because I didn't ask the question either, to be honest, whether people were, whether it really is due to the politics and that people are suddenly saying, hey, English is an important marker. But I do get the sense in Hong Kong, and being here during the protests, being here during the umbrella movement, the importance of English as a vehicle, as a marker. And it's still the quotes from my participants, which very much highlight this unique status of English in Hong Kong, that I do feel that there is a greater acceptance and greater acknowledgement that they want to embrace English as part of their unique identity, and that it is a form of resistance or a way of differentiation, because it's quite unique to Hong Kong to have this bilingual language identity. So we can't really answer the question, unfortunately, by looking back to the data, but I can tell you from the data that I'm getting from participants, it does come through to me that there's been this maybe greater recognition of the role of English in part of their own identity and the kind of embracing it. Previous research is really showing that Hong Kong has this very strong Cantonese language identity. So it's quite surprising to me to see how many people view Hong Kong as a bilingual and themselves as being bilingual. And so when I ask them about it, the quotes that I'm getting really point to English as having this unique, it's the nostalgia, it's a symbol of democracy, the past, the British heritage, and it's a symbol of the international global financial center status of Hong Kong, and they very much embrace that. And so obviously Putonghua is also a very important language in Hong Kong, and I expect to see that if I were to do the study again in 10 years, that more people would actually identify very strongly as having that trilingual identity. Right now, that there is a shift, I think, in place, and I think as the people, the younger generation that are in primary school are probably going to have a much stronger trilingual identity when they become young adults. So this is a kind of is a, it's like a picture of a moment of history, what's happened in Hong Kong. And it'll be very interesting to see what the future really holds linguistically here. But yeah, I do feel that people are very much attached to this global and local identity. So Cantonese being the local and English being the global kind of identity.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, Jette, we're going to have to wrap it up there, but I'm sure people, and you won't mind if they write to you by email. Follow things, because these are such short slots. We don't get much of a chance to really get into it. And there's a lot of interest, and Alex is nodding his head very furiously because he clearly wants to ask questions too. But we're going to have to wrap it up there because Jane Setter is on your heels and she's arriving very shortly. Listen, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And please do feel free. I'm very easy to find. Just Google my name and Hong Kong and I'll pop up. So you're more than welcome to email me. Yes.
Thanks so much, Jette.
Take care. Bye.